Some cartoons are loved for a few short years and then quietly let go. SpongeBob SquarePants was loved, and then it was kept alive long past the point its own creator wanted to stop. The man who made it tried to end it while it was still at its best. The network said no. What came after stretched across more than 2 decades. Episodes were pulled from streaming by the very people who made them. One episode upset so many viewers that fans signed their names to petitions begging for it to vanish. Another was buried over a single uncomfortable scene. The creator stepped away, came back for a while, and then passed away, and the franchise kept growing without him. Through all of it, one soft question kept returning from the people who grew up with the show. Why does the old version feel so far away now? Tonight, slowly and gently, we walk through the long decline of SpongeBob, and then back toward the era so many still miss. Welcome to Cartoonology. Let's get started. The creator who wanted to let it end. Long before any of the trouble started, before the network meetings and the pulled episodes and the slow arguments about what the show had turned into, there was a quiet man who loved the ocean far more than he ever loved television. To understand how SpongeBob SquarePants slipped, 1 year at a time, from one of the most beloved cartoons ever made into something its oldest fans now struggle to recognize, the story has to begin with him. Not with the decline, with the conditions that made the decline almost certain once a single decision had been made and could not be taken back. Stephen Hillenburg did not grow up dreaming of cartoons. He trained as a marine biologist, and he spent part of his early working life teaching and studying ocean life at a marine institute in Southern California. The sea was the thing he understood first, and the thing he kept coming back to for the rest of his life. While he was teaching, he made a small comic book to help children make sense of the strange little world of tide pools, those shallow pockets of seawater along the shore where crabs and snails and soft, odd creatures live out their entire lives in a space smaller than a kitchen sink. That comic was called The Intertidal Zone, and it was never meant to make anyone famous. It was a teaching tool, plain and simple. Its characters were sea animals, drawn with faces and small personalities, and one of them was a sponge. That sponge was the quiet seed of everything that came later. Over time, Hillenburg left teaching to study animation, and the little educational sponge slowly grew into something larger in his mind. By the middle of the 1990s, he had developed the world that would eventually be called Bikini Bottom, with its pineapple house and its fry cook and its grumpy neighbor. On the first day of May in 1999, SpongeBob SquarePants premiered on Nickelodeon. It looked at first like one more colorful children's program among many. Very few people watching that first night could have guessed what it would become, or how long the argument over its soul would eventually run. Even at the very beginning, there was a small sign of how fiercely Hillenburg guarded his idea. According to accounts of the show's early production, the network at one point wanted the characters to be school-age children, hoping to follow the success of another Nickelodeon cartoon built around grade school kids. Hillenburg disliked that direction so strongly that by these accounts, he came close to walking away from the entire project rather than give in. The compromise that rescued it was small and a little bit strange, and it ended up being perfect. SpongeBob would be a grown character with a job and a home of his own, yet he would still attend a boating school, a driving class he could never quite manage to pass, no matter how many times he tried. That one small compromise says almost everything about the man who made him. He was willing to bend, but only so far, and only in a way that kept the center of the thing exactly as he had imagined it. Those early seasons rewarded that stubbornness in full. From 1999 through the end of the 3rd season, with Hillenburg running the show day to day, SpongeBob climbed into a place very few cartoons ever reach. It became the most watched children's program on cable television. By some counts, it was drawing well over 50 million viewers in a single month, a number that sounds almost unreal for an animated show about a sponge who flips burgers. It collected the kind of award attention usually saved for more serious and more grown-up programming. And underneath the numbers, there was something harder to measure. The humor in those years was gentle and quick and genuinely odd. It trusted children to follow strange ideas. It trusted adults to notice the quieter jokes hiding behind the loud ones. People who watched as kids and people who watched as parents both seemed to find their own private reasons to love it. After the 3rd season, the show paused. Hillenburg and much of his core team stepped back from the weekly grind to pour themselves into a feature film, and the network stretched out the airing of existing 3rd season episodes to cover the gap while they worked. In 2002, Hillenburg accepted an offer offer from a film studio to make a SpongeBob movie, an offer he had actually turned down more than once before finally saying yes. He gathered a small handful of trusted people from his writing staff, among them several of the storyboard artists and writers who had shaped the early voice of the series, and together they built the movie as a kind of myth. They structured it as a hero's journey, a quest that would carry SpongeBob and Patrick up and out of the sea and onto dry land in search of a stolen crown. It was ambitious, sincere, and made with obvious love. What matters most about that film is something many casual viewers never knew at the time. Hillenburg intended it to be the ending. 3 full seasons and 1 feature movie. A complete story, set down on the table gently, while it was still good and before anyone could grow tired of it. By accounts of his thinking at the time, he felt that 3 seasons were plenty for a show built the way this one was, and he was wary of letting it stretch on until it lost the very thing that made it special. He had watched other long-running series wear themselves thin, repeating their best ideas until those ideas stopped meaning anything, and he did not want that slow fading for the sponge. He wanted to walk away while the work still made him proud. Nickelodeon saw the same show through a very different window. By the time the movie was finished, SpongeBob had become enormously profitable, one of the most valuable things the network owned. The long pause for the film had not cooled the audience down at all. If anything, it had sharpened their hunger, leaving people eager for more the moment the wait was over. There were, by some accounts, executives who quietly worried that the series had already reached its peak and might have nowhere left to climb. Yet even with that worry in the room, the network simply could not bring itself to let go of something that successful. The money was too large, and the demand was too loud. So Nickelodeon asked for more episodes, far past the ending Hillenburg had planned. That request placed the creator at a fork he had not wanted to reach. The show would continue. That part was no longer truly his to decide. What remained in his hands was whether he would keep steering it himself or step back from the wheel. And after weighing it, he chose to step back. He gave up his role as the person running the series day to day, the role that had let him guard every small choice for the first 3 seasons. In his place, Hillenburg named Paul Tibbitt, a writer, director, and storyboard artist who had already spent years inside the show and understood its rhythms from the inside out. The handover was not a war. By most accounts, it was careful and considered, the act of a man trying to leave his creation in hands he believed he could trust. Hillenburg even passed along the voice of a small recurring character, a parrot puppet he had performed himself, letting his successor take it over. He was not storming off in anger. He was loosening his grip on purpose, hoping the people left behind could carry the tone forward. The movie reached theaters in November of 2004. It opened to generally warm reviews and went on to earn somewhere around $140 million around the world, standing as one of the higher-earning animated films of that year. For anyone paying close attention, the ending Hillenburg had wanted was sitting right there on the screen, a clean and satisfying finish to the story of his characters. The sponge had taken his journey, proved himself, and come home. It could have stopped there, exactly as its maker intended. And then, of course, the show kept going anyway. This is where the quiet damage began, in a way that almost nobody could see at the time. Around the same period that Hillenburg stepped back, a great many of the original writers and storyboard artists left as well. The people who had built the strange and gentle voice of the early seasons, who knew by instinct where a joke should land and how long a silent moment should hold, scattered to other projects. Their absence would not show up on any rating chart for years. It showed up instead in 1,000 tiny choices inside the episodes themselves, in timing that ran a half-second too long, in characters who slowly began to feel like loud copies of who they used to be. The instrument was still there. Many of the hands that knew how to play it gently were gone. Hillenburg himself did not vanish completely. He stayed on in a smaller and quieter role, an advisor who would look over the new work and offer feedback during production. His name still sat in the credits. His blessing still hovered, faintly, over what the show was doing. Yet feedback from a distance is a very different thing from a creator shaping every frame in the room, and everyone involved seemed to understand that, even if few said it out loud. The center had moved. The person whose specific and stubborn vision had made the early seasons what they were had become a visitor to his own creation rather than its keeper. There is one last detail that captures how Hillenburg tried to make his own peace with a continuation he had never asked for. According to accounts of his thinking, he came to describe everything made after the movie as a kind of prequel, a set of stories that took place before the ending he had already given his serious characters in the film. It was a gentle fiction, a small, private way of squaring the circle. In his mind, the real finish had already happened up on that movie screen, and whatever the show did now lived in the time before that close. It let him keep the ending he believed in, even as the series ran on and on past it for years to come. Whether the rest of the world ever accepted that framing is another matter, and it is the kind of question the show itself never fully settled. None of what happened in 2004 guaranteed ruin. Plenty of shows survive the loss of their founder and find new life under new hands. It was always possible that the team left behind would steady the ship and keep the tone intact, but the conditions for a decline were now quietly set in place, like weather gathering far out over the water before anyone on shore feels the wind change. A show built almost entirely around one person's specific and unusual vision was now continuing without that person at its heart. The team that understood the original feeling was thinning out month by month. A network that valued the property far more than it feared overstaying its welcome was asking for episode after episode after episode, and the creator who might have said no was now offering notes from the edge of the room, trusting others to protect something only he had ever fully held. What came next would slowly reveal what happens when a world keeps spinning after the mind that dreamed it has stepped softly into the background. The pineapple was still there, the fry cook was still there, the laugh was still there, and yet, episode by episode, something underneath all of it began to change. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the show its own maker wanted to set down gently was instead handed to new hands and asked to keep running for years. The cause of the decline was now quietly in place. Next comes the slow change in the characters themselves and the strange truth that SpongeBob came back wearing the very same face while feeling like someone else entirely. Section 2, the show that came back different. There is a strange thing about watching something you love slowly change. It almost never happens in a single moment you can point to. A show you adored as a child does not break on a particular Tuesday night while you are watching. Instead, it drifts, a little at a time, in ways so small that any one of them is easy to forgive or to miss completely. A joke lands a half-second late, a character does something that feels slightly off, and a voice in the back of your mind whispers that the old version would not have done that. And then you let the thought go, because the colors are still bright and the music is still cheerful, and it is still, after all, the same show. That is how SpongeBob SquarePants changed after 2004. Not with a crash, with a long, quiet drift that took years to fully reveal itself. When the new episodes began arriving after the movie, they looked almost exactly like what had come before. The same yellow sponge stood at the same grill in the same restaurant. The pineapple was still there. The laugh was still there. That famous high giggle that had become one of the most recognizable sounds on television. On the surface, nothing had moved. And yet, by wide agreement among the people who grew up with the series and the critics who have written about it since, something underneath the surface had begun to shift in a way that would eventually become impossible to ignore. The first thing to change was the one thing that mattered most, the characters. To explain what happened, it helps to remember who these characters had been in the early seasons. SpongeBob, in those first years, was written as a grown creature with a real life. He held a job that he cared about deeply. He had a home and a pet and bills and a driving class he kept failing. His joy was childlike, yes, but it sat inside an adult who understood, at least a little, that the world could be hard and chose to meet it with enthusiasm anyway. That mixture was the heart of the character, a grown soul who refused to let go of wonder. It made him strange and warm, and in quiet moments, surprisingly moving. After the movie, that mixture slowly thinned out. By the accounts of many longtime viewers and writers who have studied the show, the grown part of SpongeBob faded, while the childlike part swelled to fill the whole frame. The character drifted from an adult with a childish streak towards something closer to an actual small child, more naive, more helpless, more prone to behaving in ways that no longer made emotional sense. The wonder was still there. The understanding underneath it began to disappear, and without that understanding, the joy stopped meaning quite as much, because joy in the face of a hard world is a choice, while joy from someone who cannot perceive the world at all is just noise. Patrick changed in his own way. In the early seasons, his stupidity was a kind of innocence, a gentle and total simplicity that came wrapped in real loyalty and real warmth. He was dim, but he was kind, and the show seemed to understand understand the difference. Over the later years, by common observation, his slowness hardened into something that could feel careless or even cruel, a dumbness that hurt the people around him rather than charming them. The warmth that had once softened every foolish thing he did grew harder to find. He was still funny at times. He was funny in a way that increasingly came at someone else's expense. Then there was Mr. Krabs, and his slow drift is perhaps the clearest of all. In the beginning, his love of money was an eccentric flaw played almost entirely for comedy. He was a tight-fisted old crab who would do almost anything for a coin, and the show winked at it. The greed was a quirk, not a danger. Across the later seasons, by the reading of many viewers and critics, that quirk darkened. His love of money curdled into something colder, a willingness to put profit over the safety and feelings of the people supposedly closest to him. The comic miser began, at times, to behave like someone genuinely without conscience. This shift matters a great deal, and it will return later in this story in its most disturbing form. But even at this early stage, the seeds were visible to anyone watching closely. Squidward suffered a different kind of loss. In the golden years, he had been given something rare for a comic character, a genuine inner life. He had real artistic longing, real loneliness, real wounds that the show treated with a surprising gentleness. The later seasons increasingly forgot that interior. More and more often, he became simply a target, a character who existed to be hurt, frightened, or humiliated, his suffering treated as the joke itself, rather than as something the show had feelings about. The complicated, aching neighbor flattened into a punching bag, and a punching bag, however expressive, cannot carry the weight that the early Squidward once carried so quietly. What connects all of these changes is a single underlying pattern. Each character was slowly reduced to one loud trait, with everything else around that trait sanded away. SpongeBob became only his enthusiasm. Patrick became only his stupidity. Mr. Krabs became only his greed. Squidward became only his misery. In the early seasons, these traits had been the surface of deeper people. In the later seasons, the surface was more and more all that remained. A cast of full personalities had quietly become a set of exaggerations of themselves. The way the show was drawn and the way it joked shifted right along with the characters. The early seasons had a particular kind of humor, situational and patient and a little bit odd, the sort of comedy that built slowly inside a strange premise and trusted the viewer to come along for the ride. The later seasons leaned, by wide critical agreement, towards something faster and broader and far more physical. The pacing sped up, the animation grew louder and more rubbery, with faces stretching and snapping in ways the early show had used only rarely, and alongside that came a steady rise in gross-out humor, in close-up shots of grime and slime and bodily mess that the original seasons had mostly kept at a distance. One small example captures the whole shift better than any general description could. In the early years, when the show wanted to play with something gross, such as the insides of a character, it tended to use that image briefly and for a clear comic purpose. The joke was the point, and the disgusting visual was just a tool in service of the joke, used and then dropped. In the later years, by the observation of many who have written about the series, the injuries and the grotesque images grew longer, more detailed, and more lingering, dwelling on the unpleasant thing well past the point of any joke. The gross had been a seasoning. It slowly became a main course, served in close-up and held on screen, until it stopped being funny and started being uncomfortable. The painful part is what this new direction actually achieved, which by most accounts was very little. People who have studied the show's reception often point out that the louder, broader, messier version of SpongeBob managed the difficult feat of pleasing almost no one fully. The older viewers, the ones who had loved the gentle wit and the quiet character moments, felt that the show had abandoned the very things that drew them in, and the change did not even reliably win over the youngest viewers in exchange, since the best of the early episodes had always worked for children too, without needing to shout. In trying to chase a broader and younger laugh, the show seemed to misplace the specific magic that had made it beloved across every age in the first place. This decline did not arrive all at once, and it is worth being honest about its shape, rather than painting every later year with the same brush. By the common understanding among longtime fans, the slide began gently in the 4th and 5th seasons, the first stretch made after the movie and after Hillenburg stepped back. Those seasons still held real bright spots, episodes that fans remember warmly, and the drop was mild enough that many viewers at the time time barely registered it. The deeper trough came afterward, in the span of seasons that many devoted fans now regard as the lowest point in the show's long history. A period where the weaker episodes were not merely flat, but actively unpleasant, and where the gems became rare enough to feel like accidents. Even there, a handful of genuinely good episodes still surfaced now and then, which only made the surrounding decline feel sadder by comparison. It would be unfair to lay all of this at the feet of the new showrunner and his team. The years under Paul Tibbitt varied in quality, and the people making the show were, by every available account, working hard and often with real affection for the world they had inherited. Some of them had been there since the beginning. They were not trying to ruin anything. They were trying to keep a beloved and enormously demanding machine running, week after week, year after year, at a pace the early seasons had never been asked to sustain. The drift in quality was less the result of any single villain, and more the natural consequence of the situation set up in the years before. A show pushed far past its planned ending, guided by a thinning crew, watched over only at a distance by the mind that had given it its original shape. What the decline really cost is something subtler than just laughs. The early show had a texture, a particular feeling that lived in the spaces between the jokes. It was in the way a quiet moment was allowed to breathe. It was in the sense that these characters were real enough to want things and to be hurt. It was in the strange, lived-in atmosphere of the world itself. That texture was quiet by nature, and the new direction was loud by nature. And the louder the show became, the harder it grew to hear the very thing that had once made it special. A whisper does not survive well in a room full of shouting. And so the version of SpongeBob that came back after 2004 was, in a sense, a stranger wearing a familiar face. It moved like the old show, and sounded like the old show, and carried all the same names and places. Underneath, it had begun to forget who its characters were and why anyone had loved them. For a long while, the result was simply weaker comedy, episodes that felt hollow where they should have felt full. But the flattening of these characters was not finished doing its damage. When a kind character forgets how to be kind, the door opens to something worse than dull. It opens to cruelty. And in a handful of episodes that fans would come to dread, that cruelty would step fully into the light. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the show came back, wearing the same bright colors, while quietly forgetting who its characters had been, trading gentle wit for louder and messier noise. The flattening had begun, and it was not done. Next come the episodes where that hollowing turned into something darker, the handful of stories so cruel that fans still begged the show to take them back. Section 3, when the jokes turned cruel. Comedy has always been able to hold a little darkness. Some of the most memorable moments in the early years of SpongeBob SquarePants were quietly sad, or strange, or touched with a loneliness that most children's shows would never dare to go near. There is a melancholy that runs underneath the best of those early episodes, a sense that the world can be hard and that some of these characters know it. The difference, in those years, was the gentleness with which the show handled such things. When the early seasons went to a dark place, they went there with care, and they came back. The darkness served the story and the feeling. It was never the whole point. That careful balance is exactly what makes the later turn so painful to watch. Once the characters had been flattened into single loud traits, once SpongeBob had become more childish, and Mr. Krabs had become colder, and the warmth had drained out of so much of the cast, a door quietly opened that the early show had always kept shut. When kind characters forget how to be kind, and when a story no longer has feelings about the suffering it puts on screen, comedy can slide into something that is no longer comedy at all. In a handful of episodes that longtime fans still speak about with real discomfort, that slide happened in full view, and the result was cruelty dressed up as a joke. Most of the worst of these episodes cluster around the same stretch of the show's life, in and near its 7th season, a period that fell squarely inside the years many devoted viewers already regarded as the low point. It is as though the flattening of the characters and the loudening of the humor reached a kind of peak together, and what came out the other side was a small group of stories that fans would spend the next decade wishing they could forget. The most infamous of them all carries a quiet, ordinary title that gives away nothing of what is inside it. In this episode, Mr. Krabs learns that his old rival Plankton has a deep and genuine fear of whales. Rather than treat this discovery as a simple comic advantage, the story has Mr. Krabs use it as a weapon, again and again over many days. He disguises himself to play on that fear, frightening Plankton repeatedly until the smaller character begins to come apart. Plankton suffers nightmares. He grows more and more desperate. And then the episode arrives at the scene that turned it into one of the most condemned half hours the show ever produced. This part of the story is genuinely heavy, and it deserves to be described plainly rather than dwelt upon. Worn down past his breaking point, Plankton lies down in the road, intending to let an oncoming bus end his life. It is a depiction of a character attempting suicide, placed inside a cartoon made for children. What made it land even harder for many viewers was the reaction of the characters around him. SpongeBob, told what Plankton means to do, responds with a flat and breezy indifference and simply moves along. Mr. Krabs, upon hearing of it, laughs and remarks that his rival looks like a complete mess. There is no real horror in the room. There is no one to stop and say that this has gone too far. The show treats a moment of genuine despair as a passing gag, and then, in its closing stretch, it allows Mr. Krabs to escape without any meaningful consequence for what he has done, even turning SpongeBob against Plankton one last time. The reaction from the audience was unlike almost anything the show had seen. By accounts of the period, viewers were so disturbed that they organized formal petitions asking Nickelodeon and its parent company to stop airing the episode altogether. People wrote at length about why a story that played attempted suicide for laughs had no place on a children's network, and why the cheerful cruelty of the surrounding characters made it worse rather than better. Among the longtime community of fans and critics, the episode is frequently named as one of the worst the series ever made, and some describe it as the very bottom of the show's long decline, the single point where the hollowing of these characters curdled into something that felt almost unforgivable. Mr. Krabs, in particular, is often pointed to here as being at his absolute worst, a comic miser finally drained of everything warm or human, and left as something close to a sadist who faces no reckoning at all. A second episode from the same era earned a similar place in the show's Hall of Shame, and it did so by aiming its cruelty at the most defenseless character of all. The story begins from a place of apparent kindness. Worried that his pet snail Gary is lonely while he is away at work, SpongeBob brings home a second creature to keep him company. That new pet, however, turns out to be a monster in the most literal sense. Whenever SpongeBob is gone, the creature terrorizes Gary, and when SpongeBob returns, it plays innocent, leaving Gary to take the blame. The painful core of the episode is how completely SpongeBob fails his oldest companion. He refuses to believe what is happening. He scolds and dismisses the very pet he claims to love. By the time the truth becomes undeniable, Gary has been pushed to the edge of real harm, nearly devoured by the thing SpongeBob brought into their home. What gives this episode its lasting reputation is the combination of that helplessness with the way it was drawn and voiced. The threatening creature was designed to be frightening rather than funny, and reviewers who have studied the episode often describe its imagery as unnerving and its sounds as genuinely disturbing, language one rarely expects to use about a SpongeBob cartoon. More than that, the SpongeBob of this story is almost unrecognizable. The character whose defining quality had always been his open heart spends the entire episode being oblivious to the suffering of a creature who trusts him completely, behaving in a way that many viewers found close to sadistic. Critics have compared it to watching animal torture played for an audience that is supposed to laugh. It regularly appears near the top of fan lists of the worst episodes, and like the whale episode before it, it became something fans actively pretend never happened. These two stories are the most notorious, but they did not stand alone. The same broad era produced a string of episodes built around the suffering of one character or another, and around the kind of lingering, detailed unpleasantness that the early show had always avoided. One such episode is remembered almost entirely for its gross-out content, following SpongeBob as a small splinter in his hand slowly festers into something swollen and infected, with the camera holding on the result far longer and far more closely than any joke could justify. Another hands Gary over to Patrick for pet sitting, with results that once again leave the poor snail in danger and pain. Yet another turns SpongeBob's hapless driving teacher, pushed past her limit, into someone quietly hoping to see him killed in a demolition derby. There is even an episode that returns to the theme of despair, placing Squidward in such a deep and hopeless state that it flirts openly with the idea of him ending ending his own life, treating that darkness with the same careless hand that the whale episode had used. Seen one after another, these episodes share a clear and troubling family resemblance. Each one takes a character the audience cares about and subjects them to torment. Each one tends to let the tormentor off the hook, offering little of the moral balance the early show had quietly relied upon. And each one lingers on discomfort, whether that discomfort is physical grossness or emotional pain, in a way that suggests the discomfort itself had become the entertainment. The gentle absurdism of the golden years, the humor that came from strange situations and warm characters bouncing off one another, had been replaced in these episodes by a humor that ran on someone getting hurt and no one caring. It is important to be fair about how the show came to this, because the cruelty was almost certainly never anyone's goal. The people making these episodes were working at a punishing pace, trying to keep a beloved machine running long past the ending its creator had planned, often without the same crew that had built the original tone. When characters have been reduced to single, exaggerated traits, the writers lose the very tools that once kept the darkness in check. A SpongeBob whose only enthusiasm cannot be trusted to notice his friend's pain, because noticing requires the inner depth that the flattening stripped away. A Mr. Krabs who is only greed has nothing left inside him to stop short of genuine harm. The conditions set up years earlier, the loss of the founder and the thinning of the crew and the relentless demand for more, made episodes like these not inevitable, but certainly possible in a way they never could have been in the early seasons. The audience understood this, even if they could not have explained it in those terms. The reason these particular episodes are remembered with such unusual force is that fans could feel the betrayal underneath them. They had loved these characters precisely because the characters were kind, or at least understandable, or at the very least treated with a basic warmth by the show that made them. To watch SpongeBob ignore Gary's terror, or to watch Mr. Krabs laugh at a despairing rival, was to watch the show forget the unspoken promise it had once kept with everyone who loved it. The promise had never been that the show would always be funny. The promise had been that it would care. Out of this discomfort grew one of the more telling habits in the show's whole community of fans. Over time, large numbers of devoted viewers simply decided that these episodes did not count. They drew a quiet line around the worst of them and chose to treat them as though they had never been made, refusing to let a handful of cruel stories sit beside the gentle ones they had grown up loving. It is a strange kind of tribute, this collective act of pretending. It says, more clearly than any review could, that the fans held a vision of what SpongeBob truly was, and that these episodes had wandered so far from that vision that the only way to protect the show they loved was to wall the worst of it off and walk away. What lingers, after looking honestly at this stretch of the show's history, is a sense of how much had quietly been lost since the early years. The cruelty did not appear from nowhere. It grew, slowly and almost logically, out of every smaller change that had come before it. The flattening of the characters, the loudening of the humor, the steady forgetting of who these people were meant to be. A whisper of melancholy in the golden seasons had been a feature, handled with grace. A roar of cruelty in the later seasons was the same impulse with all the grace removed. And once the show had proven it could go to these places, a different question began to hang over it, asked not by fans, but by the network itself. The question of whether some of what the show had made should be allowed to be seen at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So a show that once held its darkness gently, let that darkness curdle into open cruelty. In a small cluster of episodes, fans now choose to wall away and forget. The hollowing had reached its lowest emotional point. Next, the moment the network itself decided that certain episodes had gone too far and quietly began removing them from sight. Section 4. The episodes Nickelodeon buried. A show that lives for more than 20 years ends up outliving the world it was born into. The standards that felt normal when an episode first aired do not stay frozen with it. The culture around the screen keeps shifting, slowly and constantly, while the episode itself sits exactly where it was, unchanged, waiting on a shelf. And so there comes a strange moment, common to almost every long-running series, when the people who own a show look back at their own catalog and find a handful of episodes that no longer fit the world the show now lives in. With SpongeBob SquarePants, that moment arrived quietly, and the way the network chose to handle it tells its own small story about the decline and about who gets to decide what the public is allowed to see. For most of its life, the show was simply available. New episodes aired, old episodes repeated, and as streaming grew, the entire library settled into one convenient place where any viewer could open an app and watch nearly the whole run from the beginning. That ease is part of what made the eventual removals so noticeable. When something has always been there, its sudden absence stands out far more than it would for a show that had drifted out of reach on its own. Two episodes in particular became the center of this story, and they were pulled for reasons that could hardly be more different from one another. The first of the two is one of the older episodes in the whole series, made back during the golden years, in the third season that fans tend to treasure. On the surface, it is a gentle premise. Mr. Krabs is feeling his age. He overhears SpongeBob and Patrick making plans for a night out, and, desperate to recapture some sense of youth, insists on tagging along. What follows is mostly sweet and silly, since the idea of a wild night for SpongeBob and Patrick turns out to involve childish, harmless fun rather than anything truly grown up. The trouble lives in the ending. The night builds toward a scheme to sneak into someone's home and steal articles of underwear, a juvenile prank that the episode treats lightly. The twist is that the home turns out to belong to Mr. Krabs' own mother, who catches the three of them in the act and sends her grown son off to his childhood bedroom in disgrace. For years, this episode aired without much comment. Then, well over a decade after it first appeared, it quietly disappeared. According to statements the network gave at the time of its removal, the episode had already been taken out of regular rotation back in 2018, following an internal review of the show's standards, in which the network decided that some parts of the story were not appropriate for children. Later, the episode was removed from the major streaming homes of the series, vanishing from the platforms where the rest of the show remained easy to find. The network did not spell out in public exactly which element had crossed the line. Observers who looked closely pointed to the underwear stealing sequence near the end as the most likely cause, a scene that read very differently to a reviewer years later than it had to audiences when it first aired. The fate of this episode has been unusually unsettled, which is itself part of what makes it interesting. By accounts of its history, it briefly reappeared on streaming a few years after its removal, only to be pulled again not long after, as though the people in charge kept changing their minds about whether it belonged in public view. It became one of the rare SpongeBob episodes that essentially stopped airing entirely, a small hole in an otherwise complete and constantly repeating library. There is one wrinkle worth noting for the sake of accuracy. Because the show pairs two short stories into each half hour, this episode had originally aired alongside a second unrelated segment, and that companion story was caught up in the removal from digital sales as well, even though it had done nothing to earn the same scrutiny. The episode also survived, quietly, on older physical DVD collections, which means it never truly vanished, so much as it became harder and harder to reach through the easy modern channels. The second buried episode could not be more different, in age or in reason. It comes from very late in the show's run, from the 12th season, long after the golden years had passed. Its story is built around a virus. A health inspector visits the Krusty Krab and discovers a contagious illness loose in the restaurant, then seals everyone inside under quarantine. What unfolds is a small, sharp tale of suspicion and fear. The trapped characters begin to distrust one another. Anyone suspected of carrying the illness is shunned by the rest, and by some accounts, even shut away in the freezer, isolated from the group out of fear of contagion. As a piece of comedy, it sounds almost prophetic, a cartoon about how quickly people turn on each other when a sickness spreads through a closed space. The problem was timing, and the timing could hardly have been worse. The episode was set to reach audiences right as a real and frightening illness was sweeping across the entire world. With a genuine pandemic shutting down ordinary life everywhere, the network decided that a comedy built around a spreading virus, quarantine, and the shunning of the sick was simply too raw to put on the air. A network representative explained at the time that the episode centered on a virus storyline and that the decision to hold it back came from sensitivities around the very real global situation unfolding outside everyone's windows. So the episode was kept off the streaming service, and it was left out of the home release that collected the rest of its season, quietly set aside until the world felt steadier. Here, an important point of accuracy deserves to be made, because the story of this episode is often told as though it were banned forever, and that is not quite true. By the available record, the episode was held back during the worst of the real-world crisis, but it was not destroyed or permanently locked away. In time, once the immediate shock of the pandemic had eased, the episode did did make its way to broadcast after all, airing roughly 2 years after its original removal. So the more honest description is not that the network erased it, but that the network delayed it, judging that a certain moment was the wrong one to ask children to laugh at a plague. Set these two episodes side by side, and something genuinely strange comes into view. The episodes the network chose to remove were, by most measures, fairly mild. One ended with a silly underwear prank. The other was a timing problem more than a content problem. A perfectly ordinary cartoon that simply had the bad luck to be ready at the worst possible week in modern memory. Neither of them is among the episodes that fans themselves consider the show's darkest work. And that is the quiet irony sitting at the heart of this whole chapter. The genuinely cruel episodes discussed earlier, the ones built around a character's despair or the torment of a helpless pet, the episodes that fans found so disturbing that they signed petitions and chose to pretend they never existed, were for the most part left untouched. They remained available. They kept repeating. The torment stayed on the shelf, while the underwear gag and the unlucky virus plot were taken down. What this reveals is something about how these decisions actually get made. A standards review tends to look for specific, nameable categories of trouble, the kinds of content that draw obvious complaints or create obvious legal and public relations risk. A scene with a sexual edge in a children's show is easy to identify and easy to justify removing. A plague comedy released during a real plague is an obvious mismatch that any cautious executive would want to avoid. Cruelty is harder. A story that drives a character toward despair or that lets a beloved hero ignore his friend's suffering does not trip the same alarms because it does not fall into a tidy box marked unsafe. It is disturbing in a way that lives in tone and feeling rather than in a single removable moment. And so the system that buried the mild episodes had almost nothing to say about the cruel ones, which suggests that the people guarding the gate were watching for a very particular kind of danger and were, in a sense, looking the other way from the kind that actually wounded the show's oldest fans. The removals also raise a quieter and more lasting question, one that long-running shows force their owners to confront again and again. Who should decide what becomes of an episode once it exists in the world? There is a real argument that a network has every right, even a responsibility, to keep certain content away from young viewers, and that holding back a virus comedy during a pandemic was simple decency. There is an equally real argument that quietly erasing pieces of a show's history without much explanation and with the decision shifting back and forth over the years leaves audiences unable to see the full shape of the thing they grew up loving, the weak parts along with the strong. The show offered no clean answer to this, and it is the kind of tension that the record itself leaves unsettled. Burying episodes was not the only way outside pressure pressed against the show during these years. Like almost any wildly successful property, SpongeBob attracted people who believed they were owed a piece of it. The most striking example came in the form of a lawsuit demanding an enormous sum of money, well over $1 billion, from the show's creator and the network. The man behind the suit claimed that he had invented a sponge character of his own, an unemployed sponge in a small comic, years before SpongeBob ever reached television. The trouble with his claim was a matter of dates. By the accounts of the case, the comic he pointed to was not formally protected until 2003, which was 4 years after the show had already premiered, and several years after the show's own creation had begun. The lawsuit failed, but its very existence is a reminder that the show, by this point, had grown into something so valuable that it was a target pulled at from the outside by people hoping to claim a share of its enormous success. Standing back from all of it, this chapter of the show's life paints a picture of a series being managed rather than created. In the golden years, the central questions had been creative ones about what was funny and what was true, and how a strange little world should feel. By the era of the buried episodes, many of the questions surrounding the show had become defensive instead, about what to remove, what to delay, what to fight off in court, and how to keep a vast and aging library from causing trouble in a changing world. The sponge was no longer mainly a piece of art being shaped by an artist. It had become a piece of property being protected by a company, and the difference between those two things is quietly enormous. And yet, for all the removals and lawsuits, the show itself kept going, and the brand kept growing far beyond the original series. The next stage of the story is not about a single episode being pulled from a shelf. It is about what happened to the whole idea of SpongeBob after the one person who had truly understood it was gone, and about the wave of new projects that arrived in the space he left behind. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the network quietly began deciding which of its own episodes the world could still see, removing the mild ones while the cruel ones stayed in plain sight. The sponge had become a property to manage rather than a story to tell. Next, the loss of the man at the center of it all, and the wave of spin-offs that arrived in the empty space he left behind. Section 5. Milking the sponge. The hardest part of watching something decline is rarely the weak episodes themselves. Bad stories can be forgiven, or ignored, or quietly walled away by fans who would rather remember the good ones. The deeper sadness comes later, and it is quieter. It arrives when a beloved creation slowly stops being treated as a story someone loved and starts being treated as a resource to be drawn from, a well to be lowered into again and again for as long as anything valuable can be pulled up. With SpongeBob SquarePants, that shift had been building for years, but it became impossible to look away from once the one person who had ever truly understood the show was no longer there to speak for it. By the middle of the 2000s, SpongeBob had grown into one of the most valuable entertainment properties in the world. The numbers had moved far beyond television ratings and into a different scale entirely. By some accounts, the franchise had generated something in the range of $13 billion in merchandising over the years, the kind of figure that turns a cartoon character into a corporate asset. The yellow sponge was on lunchboxes and bed sheets and theme park rides, on cereal boxes and clothing, and an endless river of toys. He had become, by many measures, the single most valuable thing the network owned, and the most widely distributed property in its entire library. A character created to teach children about tide pools had become a financial engine, and engines are expected to keep running and keep producing year after year, no matter what. That pressure showed up in the way the show itself was steered. Even the man chosen to succeed the creator did not last forever in the role. By accounts of the production, the successor who had taken over the day-to-day running of the show after 2004 was eventually removed from that position around the middle of the next decade, replaced by others as the company reshaped the leadership of its prized property. When a third feature film eventually went into production, it was handled largely by a separate crew, with only limited involvement from the people who had been making the show itself. The series, by this point, was less a single creative vision being carried forward and more a brand being directed from above, its leadership rearranged as the owners saw fit. The hand on the wheel kept changing, and the wheel itself answered increasingly to a boardroom. Through these same years, the creator's own story was moving toward its close, away from the cameras and the merchandise and the corporate planning. In 2017, it became public that Steven Hillenburg had been diagnosed with a serious and incurable illness, a disease that slowly robs a person of the ability to move and, in time, of life itself. He faced it, by the accounts of those around him, with a quiet steadiness, and remarkably, he kept working. Even as the illness advanced, he continued to offer his thoughts and his feedback to the people making the show, staying connected to his creation right up until near the end. The voice cast, in later interviews, spoke warmly about how they kept trying to honor his vision in those final years, treasuring the chance to work so closely with him while they still could. On the 26th of November in 2018, Steven Hillenburg died. He was 57 years old. The man who had dreamed up an entire ocean world from a love of marine life, who had guarded that world so fiercely in its early days that he nearly walked away rather than compromise it, who had wanted to set it down gently while it was still good, was gone. For the people who had grown up with the show, and for the cast and crew who had spent decades inside the world he built, it was a genuine loss. The heart and soul of SpongeBob, as many described him, had left, and the show carried on into a future he would never see. What happened next is the part that turned grief into anger for a great many fans. Around the same period that the creator was nearing the end of his life, the network had brought in new leadership, and the new head of the network, by accounts of the time, moved quickly to expand the SpongeBob brand into new directions. Early on in his tenure, a room was gathered specifically to brainstorm ideas for spin-off series built around the SpongeBob world. The goal was clear enough. A property this valuable could support more than one show, and the company intended to find out how much more it could give. The first public sign of this plan arrived only a few months after Hillenburg's death. An unnamed spin-off was announced, and it would eventually become a prequel series following younger versions of the familiar characters at a summer camp. That show reached audiences a couple of years later on the network's streaming service. A second spin-off followed close behind, this one built around Patrick and structured as a talk show hosted from his family home. Alongside the new series came that third feature film, made by its separate crew. In a remarkably short span, the single show that Hillenburg had wanted to end after 3 seasons had become the center of a small and growing universe of spin-offs and films, expanding outward in every direction at once. To many longtime fans, the timing felt unbearable. The closeness between the creator's death and the announcement of the first spin-off struck them as something close to grave robbing. A property they associated with one man's specific love seemed to be getting carved up and multiplied the moment that man was no longer around to object. Fans organized petitions calling for the prequel to be canceled. People wrote angrily about a company they believed was using the death of a beloved creator as an opportunity to squeeze more money out of his work. Prominent voices in the show's online community accused the network outright of disrespecting Hillenburg's memory, of breaking the wishes of a man who, in their understanding, had never wanted his creation spun off into other shows at all. The phrase that captured the mood was the idea of milking the franchise, of treating a piece of someone's heart as a cow to be drained. Here, though, honesty requires slowing down, because the most important belief underneath all of that anger is not as settled as it is often presented. The widespread certainty that Hillenburg had been firmly against any spin-offs, and that the network defied his dying wishes to make them, runs into a real complication when one looks closely at the testimony of the people who actually knew him. A crew member who had worked alongside Hillenburg for many years has stated that the creator was aware of these very spin-off concepts during their early stages, and that he approved of the direction the staff were taking with them. That account, if accurate, would mean the new shows were not a betrayal of his wishes, but something closer to the opposite, projects he had seen and blessed before he died. The picture grows murkier still. Some have pushed back on that reassurance by pointing out that by the time these concepts were taking shape, Hillenburg was living with a grave illness, and they question how fully and freely he could weigh in. Others have traced the popular belief that he always refused spin-offs back to an older story, sometimes repeated as fact, about him turning down an adult-oriented spin-off years earlier, a story whose origins are difficult to verify and which may have hardened into legend without a solid foundation. What emerges from all of this is not a clean answer in either direction. The truth of Stephen Hillenburg's final feelings about the spin-offs is something the public simply cannot fully settle. The honest position is that the record is mixed, that good faith people who were actually there have offered an account that complicates the angry story, and that anyone claiming perfect certainty about a private man's last wishes is reaching beyond what the evidence can support. And yet, even setting aside the question of what Hillenburg truly wanted, the fan reaction points to something real and worth understanding. The fury was not really a careful argument about creative consent. It was an expression of grief and unease about a feeling that had been building for years. The feeling that the sponge had quietly stopped being a labor of love and had become a machine for generating value. Whether or not the creator approved the spin-offs arrived inside a larger story that fans had been watching unfold for a long time. A story in which a once singular show had been pushed past its planned ending, flattened into louder and crueler episodes, managed defensively rather than created freely, and steered increasingly by a company counting its returns. Against that backdrop, a wave of new shows launched soon after the creator's death looked to many like the natural and dispiriting conclusion of everything that had come before. That perception is the real endpoint of the decline, more than any single bad episode could ever be. The early seasons had felt like the work of someone who would have made them whether or not anyone was paying, someone protecting small choices simply because they mattered to him. The later expansion felt, fairly or not, like the work of an organization protecting an asset. The spin-offs may well be perfectly fine on their own terms, and some viewers genuinely enjoy them, but for the fans who had grown up with the original, what mattered was the shift in spirit they sensed underneath it all. The question had quietly changed. It had moved away from what would make this story better and toward what more this brand could give. There is one more layer to sit with here, and it is the saddest of all. The reason fans reacted so fiercely to the spin-offs, the reason the accusation of milking the franchise carried such sting, is that they still cared. People do not write petitions about things they have stopped loving. The anger was the long shadow of an old devotion, the protectiveness sadness of people who had loved something dearly and could not bear to watch it treated, as they saw it, like a product. In that sense, the fury over the spin-offs was the clearest possible proof of what the early show had meant. The decline had taken much, but it had not taken the love. It had only left that love with nowhere to go but backward, into memory, toward the years when the show had been something else entirely, and that is exactly where this story turns now. For 5 sections, the focus has been on what went wrong, on the loss and the cruelty and the burying and the squeezing, the long investigative account of how a beloved cartoon slipped. But the decline is only half of the reason people still talk about SpongeBob with such feeling. The other half is the thing that was lost, the specific magic of those early years that fans miss with an ache that goes deeper than ordinary nostalgia. To understand why the decline hurt so much, the story has to go back, slowly and gently, to what the Golden Age actually was, and to the strange, quiet, lived-in world that no later season could ever quite bring back. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the show became a brand to expand rather than a story to protect, and the wave of spin-offs after the creator's death turned old devotion into open grief, even as the truth of his wishes stayed genuinely unsettled. That closes the long account of the decline. From here, the story turns softly backward, toward the golden years themselves and the quiet magic that so many still miss. Section 6. What the Golden Age actually was. Going back to the early seasons feels less like watching old television and more like returning to a place. There is a particular quality to those first few years that lingers in the body of anyone who grew up with them, a warmth and a strangeness that the mind recognizes before it can explain. Put on one of those early episodes now, decades later, and within a minute or two, something settles. The colors are softer than memory expects. The pace is slower than the modern show, and underneath it all runs a feeling, hard to name, that this little world was made with care by people who genuinely loved what they were doing. To understand why the decline hurt so much, it helps to sit for a while inside what the Golden Age actually was, and to look closely at the craft that made it last. The first 3 seasons, running from 1999 through 2004, with the creator at the helm, are what devoted fans have long called the Golden Age, or simply classic SpongeBob. The labels could sound like ordinary nostalgia, the way every generation insists that the version of a thing they met first was the best. But in this case, the affection rests on something more solid than memory. Those seasons were built differently from what came after, in ways that can be pointed to and described, and that difference is the reason they have aged so gracefully while so much else faded. At the center of the Golden Age craft was a simple and patient idea about how to build an episode. The best of these early stories tended to begin with one small premise, an ordinary little situation, and then expand it slowly and imaginatively until that tiny seed had grown into a complete adventure. Consider one of the very first episodes, in which SpongeBob and Squidward simply have to deliver a pizza to a customer. There is nothing grand in that setup. It is the kind of errand that could be over in 30 seconds, and yet the episode draws it out into a strange and wonderful journey across an empty stretch of road, full of small disasters and quiet absurdities, until a humble pizza delivery has become something close to an epic. The pleasure comes not from spectacle, but from watching a modest idea unfold with patience and invention. Another early episode takes an even smaller starting point and finds even more in it. SpongeBob and Patrick receive a large new television, and rather than caring about the television itself, they become enchanted by the enormous cardboard box it arrived in. They climb inside and play, using nothing but their imaginations to turn the empty box into a pirate ship, a rocket, anything they can dream. Squidward, watching from next door, cannot understand it. He keeps trying to figure out how they are producing the elaborate sound effects he hears coming from the box, convinced there must be some hidden machine, never grasping that the magic is simply imagination itself. The whole episode runs on that one gentle idea, the gap between a mind that can still pretend and a mind that has forgotten how. It asks for nothing but a cardboard box and a little patience, and out of that, it builds something quietly profound. A second season episode shows the same patient instinct at work on a far more delicate premise. SpongeBob discovers a rude word scrawled behind the restaurant, repeats it without understanding what it means, and slowly learns that he has stumbled onto something he is never supposed to say. From that tiny seed, the episode grows into a small comic gem about innocence and language, escalating gently as the forbidden words multiply and spread to the other characters. The show never actually lets the audience hear any of the words. Each one is covered by a cheerful marine sound, a dolphin call, or a foghorn, or a boat whistle, turning the act of censorship itself into the joke. It is a clever solution to a hard problem, and it is exactly the kind of inventive restraint the Golden Age specialized in. The episode finds enormous comedy in a situation that could easily have turned crude, simply by trusting timing and sound and the sweetness of a character who means no harm at all. This way of working tells you something about the confidence of the early show. It did not feel the need to shout or to pile spectacle upon spectacle. It trusted small things to be enough. Nowhere is that confidence clearer than in an early short built with almost no dialogue at all, in which SpongeBob does little more than struggle against a stubborn pest in his front yard using a leaf-blowing device. By accounts of the production, that short had originally been meant to include spoken lines, but the team chose to let it play out in near silence instead, leaning entirely on visual comedy and timing to carry it. A show willing to make a wordless episode is a show that believes deeply in the power of the image, in the idea that a well-drawn movement and a well-timed pause can be funnier than any line of dialogue. That belief ran through the whole Golden Age, and it is one of the quiet reasons those episodes feel so different from the louder, more talkative seasons that followed. Gentleness could become the whole subject when the show chose it. In one early story, SpongeBob drifts through the dreams of everyone he knows, slipping from one sleeping mind to the next, and the episode becomes a soft, surreal tour of who these characters are when no one is watching them. In another, he gives up his job and his belongings to live quietly among the jellyfish in the fields, chasing a simple idea of freedom before slowly discovering how much he misses the small comforts of his ordinary life. These are not loud episodes. They are quiet and a little wistful, content to wander and to wonder without rushing toward a punchline. That the Golden Age could pause in the middle of all its silliness to make something this calm and this searching says a great deal about the range it commanded and about how much room it left for genuine feeling. Much of this came from the way the show was actually made behind the scenes. The early SpongeBob was built in large part by its storyboard artists, the people who draw out an episode panel by panel, shaping not just how it looks, but how its jokes are timed and how its scenes breathe. Rather than handing a finished script to animators to execute, the early process let these artists discover much of the comedy on the page as they drew, finding the funny moment in the act of sketching it. That approach leaves fingerprints all over the finished work. It gives the early episodes a handmade, character-driven feeling, a sense that the humor grew organically out of who these characters were, rather than being assembled from a formula. The strange, specific timing that fans treasure, the way a reaction holds a beat longer than expected, the small visual flourishes tucked into corners of the frame, all of it flows from a process that trusted artists to find the soul of a scene by hand. Behind that inventiveness sat a particular kind of working environment, small and collaborative and unusually free. The early seasons were shaped by a compact group of artists who shared an office and an instinct, pitching gags to one another, drawing them out by hand, and refining them together until they landed. There was room in those years for someone to follow a strange idea down an unexpected path and see where it led, because the production had not yet hardened into an assembly line racing against the clock. Ideas could be discovered rather than merely executed. The looseness of that room, the sense of a few talented people delighting one another, is something a viewer can feel in the finished episodes, even without knowing it was there. Comedy made by people enjoying themselves carries a warmth that comedy made under pressure never quite manages, and the Golden Age is full of that warmth. Much of the dreamy, faraway quality of the early show lives in its music, which deserves as much attention as its pictures. Rather than relying on a slick modern score, the show leaned on a deep library of older recordings, the kind of music that carries the flavor of another era. Steel guitars slid lazily beneath quiet scenes. Ukuleles and soft tropical rhythms gave the town its sunny, faintly old-fashioned warmth. Sea shanties and nautical horns reminded the ear, constantly and gently, that all of this was happening somewhere beneath the waves. And when an episode wanted tension or grandeur, it reached for sweeping orchestral cues that felt borrowed from old adventure films, lending small moments an unexpected weight. This patchwork of vintage sound gave Bikini Bottom a specific musical identity, nostalgic and strange and oddly soothing, a soundscape that felt like a memory of a place, rather than the place itself. The later seasons seasons, faster and busier, often buried this quality under heavier scoring. In the Golden Age, the music was given room to breathe, and that breathing is a large part of why the early episodes feel so calm, even while they are being silly. Painted with a gentle, slightly hazy quality, the backgrounds of those early seasons looked closer to a storybook illustration than to the crisp, bright flatness that television animation so often settles into. Coral and rock and the interiors of homes were rendered with a care that made them feel touchable, lit with the dim, filtered light of a real ocean floor. Against these soft painted worlds, the characters themselves were drawn simply, with clean shapes and an enormous range of expression, so that a single change in the angle of an eye could carry a whole emotion. The contrast between the rich, painterly settings and the simple, elastic characters gave the early show a visual depth that rewarded close attention. Later seasons would grow sharper and more saturated, gaining a glossy, modern polish, while quietly losing some of that hand-painted intimacy. The early backgrounds did not shout. They simply surrounded the characters with a world that looked loved. The creator's own background gave the world a foundation that no amount of writing could have faked. Because Stephen Hillenburg had truly studied the ocean and loved it, the world of Bikini Bottom was built on a real understanding of the strange creatures that fill the sea. The choices of what each character would be, a sponge, a starfish, a squid, a crab, a single-celled organism, a land squirrel in a diving suit, were not random. They came from someone who knew these animals and found genuine wonder in them. That grounding gives the early world a quiet authenticity, a sense that beneath all the silliness, there is a real place being lovingly exaggerated, rather than a generic cartoon backdrop. The show wears its marine knowledge lightly, almost invisibly, but the knowledge is there, holding everything up from underneath. And then there were the small touches, the details that no one would have demanded and that no rushed production would have bothered to include. People who have studied the early seasons often point out how many of these tiny choices Hillenburg insisted upon, even though leaving them out would have cost nothing and saved time. A particular shade of light, a texture on a surface, a throwaway background gag that almost no one would notice. These touches do not announce themselves. They simply accumulate, building a world that feels denser and more cared for than it strictly needed to be, until the viewer senses, without quite knowing why, that they are in good hands. Care is felt even when it is not seen, and the Golden Age is full of care that was never meant to be seen. None of this would have worked without the voices, and the voices of the early seasons remain among the finest casting in the history of animation. The performer behind SpongeBob brought a range to the character that is easy to take for granted, moving from helpless giggling to quiet sincerity to genuine sorrow, sometimes within a single scene, always sounding like the same person. The actors behind Squidward, Patrick, Mr. Krabs, the tiny villain Plankton, and the rest, each found something specific and human inside their strange creatures, a way of speaking that made an octopus or a crab feel like a full personality, rather than a drawing with a funny voice. The performances were not separate from the writing. They were part of how the early show built its world, breathing life into the storyboards and giving the careful timing somewhere to land. What ties all of these elements together is a single underlying attitude, a way of treating the audience that the Golden Age never abandoned. The early show trusted the people watching it. It trusted children to follow strange and patient ideas without needing to be hurried along. It trusted adults to notice the quieter layers without having those layers pointed out. It assumed intelligence on the other side of the screen, even while being gloriously, deliberately silly. And that combination of cleverness and foolishness is exactly what kept it timeless. A show made only for small children might have dated quickly. A show made only for adults would never have reached the children at all. The Golden Age threaded a needle that almost no one threads, making something genuinely silly that was also genuinely smart, and it did so without ever seeming to strain. This is the texture that fans feel and struggle to put into words. When people say they miss classic SpongeBob, they are rarely able to explain precisely what they mean, because the thing they miss is not any single joke or character or episode. It is the whole quiet architecture beneath all of it. The patience to build an adventure out of a pizza or a cardboard box. The confidence to fall silent and trust an image. The handmade warmth of a storyboard-driven process. The vintage soundscape and the soft painted worlds. The authenticity of a place built by someone who truly knew the sea. The accumulated care of 1,000 small touches. The voices that made it all breathe. And the deep, steady trust in the audience that held the entire thing together. These qualities are invisible individually and overwhelming in combination. imagination, and they are extraordinarily difficult to reproduce once the conditions that created them are gone. Honesty requires admitting that not every early episode was a masterpiece, and the Golden Age was not perfect simply because it came first. There are weaker stories scattered through those seasons, ideas that did not fully land, but the floor was high, and the ceiling was higher than almost anything else children's television had produced. And the overall feeling of the era is one of a show operating at the very top of its powers, made by people who were both talented and unhurried and free to follow their instincts. That freedom is the part that could never quite survive the years of relentless production that came after. You cannot rush care, and the Golden Age was never rushed. Yet even all of this craft, real and remarkable as it is, does not fully explain why these episodes mean so much to the people who grew up with them. Plenty of cartoons are well made, fewer are well loved. The deepest reason the Golden Age endures is something the craft made possible but did not by itself guarantee: a willingness to reach for real feeling in a way that most comedies, and almost all children's comedies, never dare to try. The early show could be funny and strange and gentle, yes. It could also, in certain rare moments, become genuinely moving, holding a real ache inside an episode that had no business carrying one. And the clearest proof of that, the single episode that fans return to again and again as the show's beating heart, belongs not to its cheerful hero at all, but to its lonely, longing neighbor. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the Golden Age was no trick of memory, but a real and careful kind of craft, patient and handmade, and quietly trusting of everyone watching. That craft is the foundation of everything fans miss. Next, the moment it reached past comedy into genuine feeling, in the episode built around the show's loneliest and most human character. Section 7, the weight of a single note. Comedy and real feeling do not often live together comfortably. Most shows that try to make a person laugh keep a careful distance from anything that might make that same person ache, because the two impulses can work against each other, and because making someone genuinely feel something is far riskier than making them smile. A joke that fails is forgotten in a second. A reach for real emotion that fails is embarrassing, and it lingers. Children's cartoons in particular tend to stay safely on the side of laughter, content to be bright and silly and pleasant. So it is worth pausing on how unusual it is that the single episode most often named as the very best of SpongeBob SquarePants is not really about a joke at all. It is about longing, and it belongs not to the show's cheerful hero, but to the one character the show was supposedly making fun of the whole time. The episode aired late in the second season, in the autumn of 2001, somewhere in the heart of the Golden Age. By the count of those who track such things, it was around the 35th episode the show had produced, and on its first airing, it was watched by roughly 4 million households, an ordinary enough night for a show that was quickly becoming a phenomenon. There was little reason at the time to suspect that this particular half hour would still be discussed and treasured and fought over decades later, and yet it has outlasted nearly everything around it, for reasons that go far deeper than its jokes, good as those jokes are. The premise is small and a little sad, in the way the best Golden Age premises tend to be. Squidward, the show's perpetually unhappy octopus, runs into an old rival from his school days, a wealthy and successful figure named Squilliam, who has everything Squidward believes he himself deserves and never received. Stung and humiliated, Squidward tells a lie. He claims that he leads his own marching band, a band good enough to perform at a grand event modeled on the biggest stage imaginable. The lie traps him. To avoid total humiliation, he now has to actually assemble a band, and the only people available to him are the residents of Bikini Bottom, none of whom can play, most of whom barely understand what a band is. SpongeBob steps in as the eager drum major. What follows for most of the episode is chaos. On its surface, the rehearsal stretch is pure comedy, and it is some of the finest comedy the show ever produced. The would-be musicians cannot follow the simplest instruction. A character genuinely wonders whether condiments count as instruments. The whole enterprise lurches from one disaster to the next, and the writing during these sequences is so dense with jokes, packed so tightly into so few minutes, that fans often describe the episode as nearly flawless on the comedy alone. Much of that comes down to the people who made it. The episode was guided by a storyboard artist and writer working at the very top of his craft, and the show's creator, who had played in a marching band himself in his younger years, brought a real and specific understanding to the portrayal of one. The humor is not generic. It is built from genuine knowledge of how a band rehearses, and how badly it can go wrong, which is exactly why it rings so true. What lifts the episode above mere excellence is the way it treats Squidward through all of this. The camera keeps returning to his face in the moments of failure, and his expressions in those moments are quietly different from the show's usual comic exasperation. There is a real exhaustion in them, a defeat that is played straight rather than for laughs. The show draws a careful line here between Squidward annoyed, which is funny, and Squidward genuinely beaten down, which is not. Most cartoons would blur that line without a second thought, milking the character's misery for one more gag. This episode holds the distinction with care. It lets his disappointment be real. Then comes the moment that turns the whole thing from a great comedy into something more. Just before the performance, with everyone expecting disaster, SpongeBob gathers the band and gives a small speech. He tells them that they are going to play this show for Squidward, because none of them would be where they are today without his help. The line lands strangely, because by any honest accounting, it is not true. Squidward did not help them. He insulted them and despaired of them, and wanted nothing more than to be rid of them. But SpongeBob is not being sarcastic. He means every word. He has experienced the chaos of those rehearsals as a gift, as time spent together, and his sincerity is total. The episode does not stop to point out the gap between what SpongeBob says and what actually happened. It simply lets his earnestness stand, and that earnestness is the emotional engine of everything that follows. And then the band plays, and against every expectation, the performance is glorious. The fumbling residents of Bikini Bottom transform, launching into a soaring rock anthem, complete with lights and fire and genuine power. The crowd, stunned, falls silent, and then erupts. Squilliam, the rival who set all of this in motion, faints clean away, and Squidward stands at the center of it, conducting, wearing an expression the show had never quite given him before and would rarely give him again. It is not the smug triumph of a winner. It is something more fragile and more moving. The look of a person who, for one single moment, gets to be exactly who he always believed himself to be. The artist no one took seriously is, briefly, vindicated. The world that had assessed him as a failure is, briefly, wrong. To understand why this scene means so much, it helps to see Squidward clearly, which most casual viewers never quite do. He is usually described as the show's grouch, the comic foil, the character who exists to be annoyed by SpongeBob and then humiliated for our amusement. That reading is not entirely wrong, but it misses the deeper truth of him, and missing that truth is the reason so much analysis of the show falls flat. Squidward is the only major character in this world who wants something real and difficult. SpongeBob wants to fry patties and be loved, and he largely gets both. Patrick wants to exist in comfort, and he does. Mr. Krabs wants money, but Squidward wants to be recognized as the artist he believes himself to be, and that desire is genuinely hard, genuinely uncertain, and genuinely human. He is, by every measure the show offers, not actually a good musician or a good painter. The world has judged his talent accurately. What makes him heartbreaking, rather than simply pathetic, is that the show refuses to fully agree with that judgment. This episode in particular suggests that maybe the talent was there all along, waiting for the right moment, and it treats his longing for greatness with complete seriousness, rather than as a joke to be punctured. That is the rare and precious thing the Golden Age could do. It could hold genuine joy and genuine longing in the very same frame, without letting one cancel out the other. SpongeBob's bottomless happiness and Squidward's aching loneliness existed side by side, each one real, each one given its due. A lesser show would have made Squidward's misery a punchline every time. A more cynical show would have undercut his moment of triumph with a cruel reversal. This episode lets the triumph stand, lets the feeling be whole, and trusts its young audience to feel the difference between a character being mocked and a character being seen. Children may not have had the words for what they were feeling when they watched that performance. Many of them felt it anyway, and they carried it. The proof of how deeply that feeling lodged itself came many years later, in a way no one could have planned. The triumphant song from that performance, a soaring anthem about victory snatched from the edge of defeat, slowly took on a life of its own, far beyond the show. And when the show's creator died, the grief of an entire generation found a focus in that song. Fans launched a campaign asking for it to be performed at the largest sporting event in the country, the same kind of grand stage the episode itself had been imitating all those years before. The campaign was meant as a tribute, a way for millions of people who had grown up with the show to say thank you to the man who made it. The petition gathered an astonishing number of signatures, characters. Well over 1 million, swelling far past what anyone expected. A flood of names from people who simply wanted to honor a children's cartoon and the person behind it. The performance itself, when it came, was a disappointment that became its own small story. Rather than the full, heartfelt rendition fans had asked for, the event offered only a brief, glancing reference, a few seconds of the show used to introduce an unrelated act. The letdown was real, and the backlash that followed was loud, with fans feeling that a sincere request to mourn had been brushed aside. The song was eventually played in full inside the stadium after the event, with a dedication to the creator, and the company behind the music chose to donate a portion of its earnings to research into the illness that had taken his life. But the more revealing thing is not how the tribute went. It is that the tribute was demanded at all. 1 million people do not rally around a single song from a single episode of a children's cartoon unless that episode reached something deep and lasting inside them. The campaign was, in its way, a measure of exactly how much the Golden Age had meant, and of how a moment of animated longing from 2001 had stayed lodged in the hearts of the people who saw it as kids. This is the heart of what fans miss, and it is why mere craft, real as it was, does not fully explain their grief. A well-made show earns admiration. A show that makes you feel something true earns love, and love is what people carry for decades. The Golden Age was beloved not only because it was clever and patient and beautifully made, but because, in moments like this one, it dared to be sincere in a medium and for an audience that rarely asks for sincerity. It let a lonely octopus have his moment of glory and meant it. It let a sponge's impossible kindness stand without irony. It trusted children with real emotion and was rewarded with a devotion that has outlived the show's own decline by a wide margin. When the later seasons flatten these characters into single loud traits, this is precisely the capacity they lost. A Squidward who exists only to be tormented cannot have a moment like the one at the heart of this episode, because the moment depends on his having a real inner life to be vindicated. A SpongeBob who is only a giddy child cannot deliver that sincere little speech and have it mean anything, because the meaning came from a grown soul choosing to be kind. The emotional core did not vanish because the writers grew careless about jokes. It vanished because the characters who could carry it had been quietly hollowed out, and feeling needs a full vessel to be held. There is one more thing the Golden Age possessed that the later years could never quite recover, and it is harder to name than craft or feeling. The early world simply felt real. Bikini Bottom, in those first seasons, had a density and a strangeness to it, a sense of being a genuine place with its own dark corners and quiet mysteries, a place that existed even when the camera was not looking. That texture is the next thread to follow, and it leads into some genuinely unsettling territory, into the eerie undertow that ran beneath all the brightness of the early show. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the Golden Age could do the rarest thing of all, holding real longing and real joy in a single frame, and a lonely octopus gave the show its truest heart. That sincerity is what later years could no longer carry. Next, the strange, lived-in world of early Bikini Bottom, and the quiet darkness that ran beneath its brightest colors. Section 8. A world that felt lived in. There is a quality that the very best fictional places share, and it is almost impossible to manufacture on purpose. The place feels as though it continues to exist when no one is watching it. It seems to have corners the story never visits, histories no one ever explains, moods and weather and silences that serve no joke and advance no plot. A world like that cannot be assembled from a checklist. It has to be built slowly by people who care about it for its own sake, and it is one of the first things a show loses when it starts running too fast. Early Bikini Bottom had this quality in abundance. It felt less like a set and more like a place, and the strange, lived-in density of that early world is one of the deepest reasons people still long for it. Part of what made the early world feel real is that it had genuine geography, places with their own character that the show returned to and treated as though they truly existed. There was the amusement park with its towering attractions. There was the sunlit beach where the residents gathered. There were the fields where SpongeBob and Patrick went to chase jellyfish, and the dark dump and the winding roads connecting it all. These were not interchangeable backdrops. Each had its own feeling, and the show seemed to know its own map, moving through it with a confidence that made the whole place cohere. A viewer could begin to feel, without ever being told, that Bikini Bottom was a town a person person could get lost in, which is exactly what makes the next thing so striking. Because the early show was not afraid to get genuinely strange, and even genuinely frightening, in a way that most children's programming carefully avoids. Consider one of the most beloved early episodes, in which SpongeBob and Patrick simply board the wrong bus on their way home from the amusement park. That small mistake carries them down, far down, into a place at the very bottom of the sea, a deep trench town where everything is different. The light is dim and strange. The inhabitants are eerie creatures, the kind that live where the sun never reaches, and they communicate in an odd, blowing language that SpongeBob cannot understand. The customs are unfamiliar and a little menacing, and the longer SpongeBob is stranded there, the more the place seems to work against him, the bus pulling away again and again just as he reaches it, the darkness pressing in. There is real unease in that episode, a genuine sense of being lost somewhere wrong and far from home, and the show lets that unease breathe rather than rushing to a joke. It trusts a child to sit inside a creepy, lonely feeling for a few minutes and come out the other side. An even stranger early episode sends Squidward on an accidental journey through time. Fleeing from SpongeBob and Patrick, he hides himself in the restaurant's freezer and ends up frozen there, sealed away, only to thaw thousands of years in the future. What follows is one of the most unusual things the show ever attempted. Squidward wanders a future Bikini Bottom that is alien and cold, hears an eerie voice repeating a single word about the future over and over, and grows increasingly desperate to get home to his own time. He stumbles into a vast, blank, white void, a nowhere place, stretching empty in every direction, and there, alone in the nothing, he comes close to despair. Eventually, he travels backward instead, into a primitive past, where he accidentally introduces SpongeBob and Patrick's distant ancestors to the very pastime the modern characters love. The episode is funny in places, but its lasting impression is something else entirely. It is a small meditation on time, on loneliness, on the terror of being utterly out of place, dressed up in the body of a cartoon about a fry cook. Few children's shows would even think to go there. Fewer still could make it land. The early show could do outright horror, too, when it wanted to. In one famous second season episode, the restaurant stays open through the night for the first time, leaving SpongeBob and Squidward alone together in the small hours. To frighten his co-worker, Squidward invents a ghost story, a legend about a vengeful figure who haunts the night shift, and he lists off the eerie signs that supposedly herald the monster's arrival. He means it as a cruel little prank. Then, one by one, the signs he invented begin to come true. The lights flicker exactly as he said they would. A phone call comes with nothing but breathing on the line. A bus pulls up outside at the stroke of midnight, though no such bus should run at that hour. The dread builds slowly and genuinely, the comedy draining away as the atmosphere tightens, until both characters and the audience are truly unsettled. The eventual punchline does not erase the fear that came before it. The episode had committed to being scary, and it earned the chill it delivered. What connects these episodes is a willingness to let the world be more than a stage for gags. Early Bikini Bottom had shadows. It had places where the light did not reach, and feelings the jokes did not resolve. There was a melancholy threaded even through the cheerful stories, a loneliness in Squidward, a desolate emptiness in certain long stretches of road, a quiet sadness that the show was confident enough to let the audience feel. The brightness was real, but it was not the only thing. It sat on top of something deeper and stranger, and the contrast between the sunny surface and the dark undertow is a large part of what gave the early world its texture. A place that is only cheerful feels thin. A place that is cheerful with shadows underneath feels alive. This depth was possible because of the way the early show was made, in the unhurried, hand-built manner described before. When storyboard artists are given the time and trust to discover an episode by drawing it, they can afford to linger. They can hold on an empty landscape a beat longer than strictly necessary. They can let a creepy moment sit. They can build a strange town at the bottom of the sea with care, populating it with odd creatures and odd rules simply because the world deserves it. Atmosphere is expensive in the sense that it costs time and patience, and the Golden Age had both. The show was not yet on the relentless treadmill that the later years would become. It could afford to build a place rather than just a series of events, and so it did. The loss of this quality in the later seasons is one of the subtler casualties of the decline, harder to point to than a cruel episode, but felt just as keenly. As the show sped up and grew louder, the world flattened. Bikini Bottom became brighter and busier and more frantic, but also, in a strange way, emptier. It turned into a backdrop, a colorful surface against which gags happened, rather than a place with its own depth and mood. The shadows were paved over, the quiet was filled with noise, the strange corners were straightened out. The later world rarely lets a viewer feel lost or lonely or unsettled, because it rarely slows down enough to let any feeling settle at all. It is a town that exists only while the camera is pointed at it, and somehow a child can sense the difference, even if they could never put it into words. It is worth dwelling on how unusual the early approach truly was, because the strangeness was not an accident or a side effect. The show's creator had a clear instinct that children could handle far more than most programming gave them credit for. He trusted them with dread, with melancholy, with existential strangeness, with the eerie and the sad and the genuinely odd. He did not believe a children's show had to be relentlessly safe and reassuring. He believed it could take a young viewer somewhere strange and a little frightening and trust them to come back. That trust is the same trust discussed earlier, the faith in the intelligence and resilience of the audience, applied now not to jokes, but to atmosphere. And it produced a body of episodes that linger in the memory precisely because they dared to be more than pleasant. This is why so many adults who grew up with the show find that certain early episodes have stayed with them in a way the bright, busy later seasons never could. The trench town at the bottom of the sea, the empty white void of the time travel episode, the flickering dread of the night shift. These are not remembered as jokes. They are remembered as places and feelings, as experiences a young mind had and carried forward. They lodged themselves deep because they were built deep with care and patience and a willingness to be strange. The cheerful later seasons, for all their color and energy, rarely produced anything that lodges that way, because nothing lodges that does not first slow down and reach below the surface. There is something almost paradoxical in all of this, and it is worth naming plainly. The episodes that make Bikini Bottom feel most like a real and beloved place are often the ones that make it feel most unsettling. The darkness is not the opposite of the warmth. It is part of how the warmth becomes believable. A world with genuine shadows is a world worth caring about because it feels like it has stakes and depth and a life of its own. When fans say they miss the old Bikini Bottom, they are partly missing this, the sense of a place dense enough to get lost in, strange enough to be a little afraid of, and real enough to love. The flattening of that world into loud, safe noise was a quieter loss than the cruel episodes, but for many, it cut just as deep. And there is one final layer to the strangeness of early Bikini Bottom, a layer that does not live inside any single episode at all. It lives in the very name of the place, and in the real history buried beneath it. For years, fans have noticed something uneasy lurking at the foundation of this sunny underwater town, a connection to one of the darkest chapters of the last century, a possibility that the cheerful world was built, quite literally, on top of catastrophe. Whether that connection was ever truly intended is a genuine mystery, one that the people who made the show have never fully settled. It is the strangest thread of all, and it is where this story turns next. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the early world felt truly lived in, dense with shadow and silence and strange places a child could get lost in. And that depth quietly vanished as the later show grew loud and flat. The darkness was part of what made it real. Next, the unsettling question hiding beneath the town's very name, and the true history that may lie at the bottom of Bikini Bottom. Section 9. The mystery under the surface. Some places carry a weight that a person can feel before they understand it. A name can hold a history inside it, quietly, so that even those who repeat the name every day never notice the shadow folded into its sound. For a show watched by hundreds of millions of children, the name of its setting was spoken constantly, cheerfully, without a second thought. Bikini Bottom. It rolls off the tongue as something silly and bright. And yet for years, a growing number of fans have looked at that name and at the world built beneath it and felt a chill of recognition. Because bikini is not only a silly word, it is also the name of a real place, and the real place holds one of the darkest stories of the last century. The real Bikini is an atoll, a ring of small islands and coral far out in the Pacific Ocean, part of the Marshall Islands. For countless generations, it was simply home to the people who lived there, a quiet community of fewer than 200 souls who fished its waters and knew its shores. Then, in the years after the Second World War, the United States gained control of that part of the Pacific and chose Bikini Atoll for a terrible purpose. It would become a proving ground for nuclear weapons. The people who lived there were moved away away from their ancestral home, told it was temporary, told it was for the good of all mankind. They left their islands behind, and in many ways they never truly got them back. What followed, between 1946 and 1958, was a long campaign of nuclear testing. Over those 12 years, the United States detonated dozens of nuclear devices in and around the atoll, more than 60 in total. The most powerful of them came in the spring of 1954, a hydrogen bomb test whose force is difficult to even imagine, a blast carrying the equivalent power of around 1,000 of the bombs that had devastated Hiroshima. That single explosion destroyed islands outright and spread radioactive fallout across a vast area, contaminating the sea, the land, and the people who live nearby. The damage did not end when the testing did. The radiation lingered, and it lingers still, with a stubbornness measured not in years, but in generations. The human cost of all this is the part that should never be reduced to trivia. The displaced people of Bikini became long-term exiles, scattered and longing for a home they could not safely return to. When the government tried, in the 1970s, to bring some of them back to their islands, the attempt ended in fresh tragedy. The returnees were found to have absorbed dangerous levels of radioactive material simply by living there, by eating the food that grew in the contaminated soil. And so they had to be removed again, uprooted a second time from the only place they had ever wanted to be. Their islands remain, by and large, unsafe to this day. This is real history, fully documented and beyond dispute. A story of real people who suffered enormously and whose suffering continues. It is not a theory. It is the foundation on which the rest of this section rests. Against that grim and factual backdrop sits the question that has fascinated fans for years. Is it a coincidence that a cheerful cartoon about mutated-seeming sea creatures who talk and walk and build machines and behave in ways no real ocean animal ever could is set in a place that shares its name with a nuclear test site? The theory that grew up around this question began, by most accounts, among fans discussing the show online, and it spread because it is genuinely difficult to unsee once it has been pointed out. The core idea is simple and unsettling. Bikini Bottom, the theory proposes, sits directly beneath the real Bikini Atoll, on the ocean floor below the very waters where the bombs fell. And the strange creatures who live there, the ones who speak and reason and feel, are what they are because of the radiation that soaked into the sea. They are, in this reading, the mutated descendants of ordinary marine life, transformed by a catastrophe they never understood. Once a person accepts that frame, the theory's supporters argue, small details across the show begin to take on a new and eerie meaning. They point to Sandy, the land creature who lives underwater inside a protective suit, and connect her to the animals that were kept aboard naval vessels during the testing, suggesting her very name gestures toward the sand thrown up by the blasts. They point to the deep trench town visited in that lonely first season episode, the strange place at the bottom of the sea, whose inhabitants are even more bizarre and warped than the residents of Bikini Bottom itself, and they reinterpret it as a crater left by an explosion, which would neatly explain why its creatures seem so much more mutated. They note the show's fashion and design, which often echo the styles of the 1940s and 1950s, the exact era of the testing. They observe that the desolate little island, sometimes shown in the show's opening, resembles photographs of the real atoll, and they point to a particular second season episode in which an explosion blooms into a shape unmistakably like a mushroom cloud, the signature image of a nuclear blast, noting that the show tends to draw its big explosions in that same telltale shape again and again. It is important to be careful and honest here, because this is precisely the kind of place where speculation can be mistaken for fact, and the rules of honest storytelling demand a clear line between what is known and what is guessed. Some of the supposed evidence is solid and verifiable, such as the real history of the atoll and the recurring shape of the show's explosions. Other pieces are far shakier. There have been claims, for instance, pointing to references to the atoll in an early script said to come from the show's pilot, but the authenticity of that document has never been firmly established, and it should be treated as unproven rather than as evidence. The honest position is that the theory rests on a mixture of undeniable real history, a handful of suggestive visual details, and a good deal of interpretation that could just as easily be the human mind finding patterns where none were intended. The people who actually made the show have never given the theory a clear answer, and that silence is a large part of what keeps it alive. When the network has been asked about it directly, the response has tended to be a gentle deflection reflection, a simple statement that the show is set in a place called Bikini Bottom and nothing more, which neither confirms nor truly denies the deeper connection. There have been moments when individual people connected to the show seem to lend the idea some weight, and claims have circulated that someone involved in making it acknowledged a link, but these accounts are scattered and uncertain, and they fall well short of an official confirmation. Crucially, there is no direct evidence that the show's creator ever intended Bikini Atoll to be the literal setting, with all the dark implications that would carry. He was a marine biologist who loved the ocean, and the name may simply have been a real and slightly cheeky place name that suited an underwater world, chosen for its sound rather than its history. The truthful answer to whether the connection was intended is that no one outside the original creative circle can say for certain, and the show itself has left the question deliberately open. This is exactly the kind of unresolved mystery that the rules of honest analysis require to be left unresolved. To declare the theory true would be to invent a certainty that does not exist. To dismiss it entirely would be to ignore real history and a genuine pattern of details. The most truthful thing that can be said is that the connection is possible, that some of its supporting points are real and some are not, and that the people who could settle it have chosen, so far, to let it remain a mystery. It hangs over the show like fog over water, neither fully present nor fully gone. And here is where this strange thread ties back to everything that came before, to the question of why fans miss the classic era so deeply. Whether the nuclear connection was intended or not, its mere possibility points to something true about the texture of the early show. The Golden Age world felt dense and layered and slightly haunted, as discussed earlier, full of shadows and strange corners, and a melancholy that ran beneath the brightness. A world that can plausibly be read as standing on the site of a real catastrophe is a world with that kind of depth built into its very foundations. The early Bikini Bottom carried a weight, a buried gravity, that made it feel like more than a generic cartoon town. It felt like a place with a past, even a tragic one, and that hidden heaviness gave its cheerfulness a strange and resonant power. The brightest things often shine hardest against the darkest backgrounds, and the early world had a darkness underneath it, whether the audience consciously knew it or not. The later seasons, for all their energy, never engaged with this depth and never seemed even aware of it. The flattened, frantic Bikini Bottom of the decline years was too busy and too loud to carry any buried weight at all. It was a surface with nothing underneath, a bright stage that did not feel as though it stood on anything. The possible nuclear foundation, real or imagined, belongs entirely to the early world, because only the early world was built with the kind of patient strangeness that could hold such a thing. A town that might rest on the floor of a poisoned sea is a town worth wondering about for decades. A town that is only a backdrop for gags is forgotten the moment the screen goes dark. There is a quiet sorrow in all of this, fitting for the real history at its center. The people of the real Bikini Atoll lost their home to a force they did not choose and could not control, and their loss is ongoing and genuine. It would be wrong to let that fade entirely behind a cartoon. And yet there is something oddly fitting too in the idea that a children's show might have carried a faint echo of that history down through the years, hidden in plain sight, felt by millions who never knew its source. If the early show did fold a real tragedy into its foundations, knowingly or not, it would be one more example of the depth and seriousness that lived beneath its silly surface. One more reason the Golden Age resonates in a way the later years never could. What remains after following all of these threads is a fuller picture of exactly what was lost. The craft, the feeling, the lived-in world, the buried weight of real history. These are the things fans reach for when they say they miss classic SpongeBob, even when they cannot name them. And so the final question is the hardest one of all. If the Golden Age was so rich, and the longing for it so deep, why has it never come back? Why, even when the show's own creator returned, could the magic not be rebuilt? That is the question this story must end on. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So beneath the brightest cartoon town may lie the shadow of a real catastrophe, a mystery the show has never settled, and that gave the early world its buried weight. That hidden depth is part of what fans ache for. Next, the final question: why the Golden Age never returned, even when the man who made it did. Section 10. Why it stays gone. Every long story about something lost eventually arrives at the same quiet question, the one that has been waiting patiently underneath all the others. If the Golden Age was so rich, if the longing for it runs so deep, if a million people will rally around a single song from a single early episode decades later, then why has it never... The clearest test of that hopeful assumption came when the one person most likely to succeed actually tried. After years of watching from the edge of the room, offering notes from a distance while others ran the show, the creator came back. Early in the second decade of the show's life, it was announced that Steven Hillenburg had returned to a more active role, stepping in once again as the guiding executive presence over the series he had built. For the first time in a very long while, the man whose specific vision had defined the golden age was meaningfully involved in steering the ship again. For fans who had spent years mourning what the show had become, the news carried a flicker of real hope. If anyone could find the old frequency again, surely it would be the person who had set that frequency in the first place. And something did change. The seasons made during and after his return are generally regarded as better than the deep trough that had come before, the period fans had marked as the lowest point. The cruelty softened. The characters began, slowly, to feel a little more like themselves again, recovering some of the dimension that had been sanded away during the worst years. A handful of episodes from this later period earned genuine praise, and some of that praise was quietly connected, in the minds of viewers, to the creator's renewed influence. The show, in these years, seemed to remember a few things it had forgotten. It steadied. It found its footing in a way it had not for a long while. By any fair measure, his return helped. But it did not bring the golden age back, and it was never going to. And the reason it could not is the heart of this entire story. When Steven Hillenburg returned, he did not return to the show he had left. He returned to something else that happened to share its name. The thing he had walked away from after 3 seasons had been a small, nimble, hand-built production made by a tight circle of passionate people working at an unhurried pace, free to follow their instincts, watched over by a creator with something close to total control, and not yet weighed down by the expectations that come with being one of the most valuable properties on Earth. The thing he came back to was a vast, fast-moving franchise, a machine that had to produce episode after episode on a punishing schedule, populated by characters who had been flattened over years of other hands, surrounded by spin-off plans and merchandise empires and corporate priorities, and answerable, always, to the immense commercial weight it now carried. He was the same man. The world he stepped back into was not the same world, and no single person, however gifted, can recreate a moment by walking back into the place where the moment used to be. This is the truth that the longing for classic SpongeBob keeps bumping against. What fans miss is not a formula that can be rediscovered, not a recipe that was simply forgotten and could be looked up again. What they miss is a convergence, a rare and fragile alignment of conditions that all happened to be true at the same time during those first 3 years, and that have never all been true at the same time since. The Golden Age was not a method, it was a moment, and moments, by their nature, do not return on demand. It is worth gathering those conditions together one last time, because seeing them all at once reveals why their loss was so complete. There was the unhurried pace, the freedom from the relentless treadmill, which gave the early show the time to build atmosphere and let scenes breathe and discover comedy by hand. There was the small, devoted crew, the storyboard artists and writers and performers who knew the world intimately and shaped it with care, before so many of them scattered. There was the creator's deep and specific vision, grounded in a real love of the ocean, protected so fiercely that he nearly abandoned the whole project rather than compromise its heart. There was the creative freedom that comes before a thing becomes too valuable to risk, the permission to be strange and slow and sincere, to make a wordless episode, or a frightening one, or a genuinely sad one, because no one was yet guarding billions of dollars of brand. And there was the trust in the audience, the faith that children could handle wit and dread and longing and existential strangeness, which ran underneath every choice the early show made. Each of these conditions made the others possible, and together they produced everything this story has tried to describe. The patient, hand-built craft of the early episodes came from the unhurried pace and the small crew, the capacity for real feeling. The lonely octopus, given his moment of glory and meant, came from the creative freedom and the trust in the audience. The lived-in, shadowed world, dense enough to get lost in, came from the time to build atmosphere and the willingness to be strange. Even the buried weight of real history, the faint and unsettling possibility folded into the very name of the place, belongs to a show made with enough depth and seriousness to carry such a thing. These were not separate achievements. They were all expressions of the same underlying conditions, and when those conditions ended, all of it ended together. together. Seen this way, the long decline traced through the first half of this story stops looking like a series of mistakes and starts looking like something more inevitable and more sad. The flattening of the characters, the loudening of the humor, the slide into cruelty, the defensive management of the brand, the wave of spin-offs after the creator's death, all of it. These were not simply the failures of people who could have done better. They were, in large part, the natural consequences of the conditions changing. Push a show far past its planned ending, and the pace becomes a treadmill. Scatter the small crew, and the hand-built care becomes impossible. Turn the show into a multi-billion-dollar property, and the creative freedom narrows into caution and management. Lose the creator's full control, and the specific vision blurs. The decline and the golden age are two sides of a single coin. The same forces that made the early years magical were the forces whose absence made the later years hollow. The magic and the decline were never really separate stories. They were one story, told forward and then backward, about what happens when a rare alignment of conditions opens and then closes. There is something almost gentle in understanding it this way, even though the understanding is sad. It means the decline was not a betrayal by villains, and the people who made the later show were not careless or contemptuous of what they had inherited. They were, by every available account, working hard and often with real affection, trying to keep an enormous and demanding machine running under conditions that made the old magic genuinely unreachable. The cruelty of the worst episodes was not malice. It was what happens when flattened characters are pushed through a fast production with no time to remember who they were. Even the corporate squeezing that so enraged fans was less a moral failing of particular people and more the ordinary behavior of a large company protecting an extraordinarily valuable asset. There is no satisfying villain to blame, which is part of why the loss feels less like an outrage and more like a grief. Things ended not because someone destroyed them, but because the conditions that sustained them quietly passed. This pattern reaches far beyond one cartoon about a sponge, which is perhaps the deepest reason the story resonates. The things that move us most are very often made in brief windows of freedom, small spans of time when a group of talented people happen to have enough room and enough trust and enough lack of pressure to follow their instincts towards something true. Those windows tend not to stay open. Success itself usually closes them, because success brings money, and money brings expectations, and expectations bring caution and speed and management, all of which slowly strangle the very freedom that produced the thing worth being successful about in the first place. The golden age of SpongeBob is a small and vivid example of a pattern that plays out across art again and again. The early, hungry, unhurried work carries a spark. The later, valuable, carefully managed work, however competent, struggles to find that spark again, because the conditions that lit it have been replaced by the conditions of its own success. For the generation that grew up with the show, the longing carries one more layer, quieter and more personal than any analysis of production conditions. To miss classic SpongeBob is, in part, to miss the version of oneself that first watched it. The children who sat close to the screen in those early years, who felt the dread of the trench town and the triumph of the marching band, and the strange, empty sorrow of the time travel void, have grown up. They carry those feelings still, but they carry them now from the far side of childhood, looking back. The ache for the golden age is partly an ache for a time when a cartoon could fill an entire afternoon, when the world was smaller and the imagination was larger, when an empty cardboard box really could become a pirate ship. The show was a companion to a particular moment in a particular kind of life, and that moment, like the golden age itself, does not return. Some of the grief that gets attached to the later seasons is really grief for the simple passage of time, displaced onto a yellow sponge, because the sponge is easier to mourn than the years. And yet, for all of this sadness, the story does not have to end in mourning, and it should not, because the golden age is not actually gone in the way that lost things are usually gone. It was captured. It exists, complete and unharmed, preserved in those first 3 seasons and the film that was meant to close them. The patient craft, the lonely octopus and his moment of glory, the lived-in shadowed world, the strange buried weight of it all, every bit of it is still there, exactly as it was, waiting on a shelf to be watched again. The decline did not reach backward and ruin what came before. The cruel episodes did not erase the gentle ones. The corporate machine did not corrupt the early work. The golden age sits safely on the far side of all of it, untouched by everything that followed. followed, available to anyone who wants to return to it. In that sense, the most consoling truth in this entire story is that the thing fans miss was never truly taken from them. It was only surrounded, over the years, by a great deal of noise. The noise can be set aside. The early seasons remain. There is a kind of peace available in accepting that the golden age was a moment rather than a method. It releases the show from the impossible demand that it forever match its own beginning, a demand no long-running series could ever meet. It lets the later seasons be what they are, sometimes good and sometimes weak and sometimes worse, without the constant painful comparison to a standard that depended on conditions that no longer exist. And it lets the golden age be honored for exactly what it was, a brief and beautiful window when a group of people made something far stranger and deeper and more sincere than a children's cartoon needed to be, simply because they had the freedom and the love to do it. The window closed, as windows do, but it was open once, and what came through it while it was open is permanent. The creator understood something like this from the very beginning, which is the final irony worth sitting with. He had wanted to end the show after 3 seasons precisely because he sensed that the conditions which made it special would not last, that pushing on would mean watching the magic slowly leak away. He was not being precious or difficult. He was, in his own quiet way, trying to protect the golden age by stopping while it was still golden. The world did not let him. The show was too valuable to end, and so it continued, and the slow leak he had feared came to pass more or less exactly as he must have imagined it might. In wanting to let the show end, he was trying to preserve the very thing that fans now miss. He understood, before almost anyone, that some things are made better by being allowed to stop. What stays with anyone who looks closely at this story is not really anger at the decline, though the decline was real, and some of its episodes were genuinely terrible. What stays is a tenderness for the brief, bright thing at the center, and a deeper appreciation for how rare and fragile such things are. A marine biologist who loved the ocean made a small comic to teach children about tide pools, and out of that grew a world that an entire generation carried in their hearts. For 3 years, the conditions held, and that world was as good as anything its medium has ever produced. Then the conditions changed, as conditions do, and the world grew loud and flat, and was squeezed for everything it could give. And still, beneath all the noise of the long years that followed, the original spark sits quietly, preserved, glowing, exactly where it was left, for anyone who cares to go back and find it. The golden age stays gone only in the sense that the moment that made it has passed. The work itself stays, and the longing for it, far from being something to be cured, turns out to be one of the truest measures of how much that work was worth. In the end, the slow decline of SpongeBob SquarePants is the story of a small miracle that happened once and could not be repeated, told by the people who loved it and never quite stopped. The miracle does not need to happen again to have been real. It happened, it was caught, and on any quiet night, it remains only a few minutes away, as patient and as strange and as gently devastating as it ever was, waiting at the bottom of the sea for anyone willing to take the wrong bus home and find it. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.